So the first thing I want to talk about is broadly the context of the Iranian nuclear program, just to get that out of the way so that there's no, I think, misunderstanding about that. Iran has a very old program which goes back to the 1950s. It's a program that begins in the Atoms for Peace process that was pushed largely by the US government, in other words, to provide countries, if they joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty, 1957, to provide them with nuclear material so that they can have a civilian program. By the way, I oppose, just for the record, I hate all nuclear programs, civilian, military, whatever, but this is the nature of international law, that you provide them with material for a civilian nuclear program, and then they have to, sort of suggest they will not proliferate the material or the technology, and therefore they will also not move for any kind of weaponization of nuclear material. Iran duly signed the NPT, in 1958. The United States government provided much of the technology, also the funding. It's that interesting way in which America funds these things. America provides funding through taxpayer money, and then private American companies come and build, the power, whatever the materials that need to be built. So this was the process, and Iran continued with this till 1979, when, of course, in the tumult of the Iranian Revolution, the program was largely suspended and, went to seed. So let me stop there for a minute and give you a parallel example. India in 1957 refused to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, saying that this was a violation of sovereignty, and using, I think, a pretty decent argument of what they called nuclear apartheid. For instance, they argued, why is it that the countries with nuclear bombs are allowed to maintain them, whereas the rest of us have to surrender the right to have nuclear weapons? This seems to be the recipe for an unequal world, and so we are not going to sign the NPT. Meanwhile, India illegally began to, a nuclear project in the 1960s, and in 1974, very dramatically tested nuclear weapons. Not a civilian program, but a weapons program. This was in 1974. There was some pressure on India at the time, but India was lucky. It had just signed with the Soviet Union the Indo-Soviet Peace Agreement of 1970, Friendship Agreement of 1971, and that gave India some breathing room. The nuclear program continued. Materials came from various places, a lot of it indigenously manufactured. And then finally, when the Soviet Union collapsed, by the time the program was fairly well developed. India didn't sign the Comprehensive Test Ban Agreement, again saying that it was an unequal apartheid-like treaty. In 1998, for the second time, tested nuclear weapons again. These are two nuclear weapons tests, no ambiguity. I'm not even going to use the Israel case as a parallel. I'm just suggesting the India story, because it's very interesting that then, after 2003, which is going to become an important year for the Iran case, after 2003, the Bush administration sends envoys to India and says, we would like to bring you out of the nuclear cold. Remember, India is not a signatory to any international nuclear treaty, despite being on the executive board of the International Atomic Energy Agency. It's one of the inconsistencies in the world architecture. You can have no signature on a treaty, and yet you can have a position of responsibility in the IAEA. At any rate, the United States sent envoys. Condoleezza Rice arrives in India, and she says, we would like to have a civilian program for you. We'd like to, vouch for you in the nuclear suppliers group, which is what is going to provide the material for reactors. And also, we're going to make sure you get any advanced technology you need. Now, interestingly, the quid pro quo offered by the Bush administration was, if you do this, if we do this for you, you have to vote against Iran in the International Atomic Energy Agency meetings on non-compliance of Iran on certain, measures that the IAEA had put in place for Iran. I just want you to think about this for a minute. Here's a rogue nuclear state, my country, India, which has signed no agreement, which has a nuclear weapons program, has twice tested a weapon, and in 2005 signs a strategic agreement with the United States, where the United States will provide India with political and diplomatic backing at the highest level for India to be out of the nuclear cold. Meanwhile, it has to vote against a country that is a signatory to the international agreements and within a, a frame of a range of compliance is yet within the treaty, meaning they were not so far out of the treaty range. No country complies 100%. No country says, come and look at everything. They always say there's a door which you can't open, as a way to protect sovereignty. It may be silly, it's a childish game. The door is actually behind it, there's cleaning supplies, but they still play this game. Or behind the door is a weapons program. We don't know, but nonetheless, they are within a treaty compliance framework, whereas India was not. In other words, the objection to Iran's program, just to underline this, was not about international law. It was always about politics. It was always about the nature or character of the government in Iran. Could it be allowed to have a weapon? Therefore, Iran, was not to be allowed because the West had decreed that its character was wrong. In other words, this is not the UN Charter as you know it. This is not about, following the letter of, say, the IEA or the NPT or whatever. This is about a certain group of countries deciding who has the moral character certificate to have a nuclear program, whether civilian or weapon, and who does not get a moral character certificate. This is a perfectly reasonable way to run the world, but perhaps for that one needs to revise the UN Charter in compliance with this way of running the world, if that indeed is the way. I'm not trying to be naive here. I'm not saying that the world should be run by law and it's run this way. I just want to suggest that this particular instance is entirely about politics and about who gets to determine who should have a program and who shouldn't. Well, the second point I want to make along with this is that in order to hem in Iran, to push it to, in a sense, to do what? To roll back entirely on the nuclear program, to stop processing material to X level. It's very interesting where the goalposts are. Different people have different understandings of the goalposts. Perhaps the clearest depiction of the goalpost was when Mr. Netanyahu went to the General Assembly, a year ago, with the drawing of the bomb, and he drew the red line. He says, that's the red line, it cannot be crossed. But actually, did he really mean that the red line was below the entire drawing? It's not clear what they mean by, limiting Iran's access to a nuclear program. At any rate, in order to pressure Iran, the strategy of, bomb Iran was not directly on the cards. The Obama administration doesn't have the temperament always to bomb or go into what it sees as intractable conflicts. It likes a little aerial bombardment here and there, but is loath to do anything beyond that. Therefore, the sanctions regime was the most important weapon of the West against Iran. Now, I had written a note for IFI on India's Iran policy, where it was interesting that right through this period when India is voting against Iran in the IAEA, and by the way, this is not a third-rate country being asked to vote against Iran. They needed what the United States ambassador in Delhi, David Mulford, had said was that the reason to get India to vote is much more significant than the one vote in the IAEA. India retains a kind of moral authority in the G77, in the non-aligned movement. It retains some moral authority. And if India breaks ranks with the rest of the world, this is going to give cover to other countries to come out and also say Iran should not have a nuclear program. So India's vote was essential, but at the same time, as they were pushing India to vote in this way, India-Iran trade was continuing. And it was continuing because Iran has oil and natural gas, and India is entirely energy reliant and had been importing oil from Iran, a very large, but 12-13% of Indian energy was coming from Iran. The Saudis at the time in the 2000s said we'll substitute for Iranian oil, but as I learned very quickly from the Indian Oil Ministry, from the ONGC, the parastatal company, that there are different kinds of oil. I didn't know that, not having covered the energy sector, and that we'd have to change our processing units to deal with the different oil. It's much cheaper for us in the medium term to continue to buy Iranian oil. The problem was the West had by then, because the main financial network in the world called the SWIFT network is based in Brussels, the West had, through pressure on the EU and on the SWIFT network, cut Iran off the SWIFT network. India had been buying Iranian oil through a bank in Turkey, the Halk Bank. That route was closed down. Then India and Iran cut a deal where India bought oil and paid Iran in rupees in Indian banks. The Iranians have a problem. They prefer to buy American wheat, even till today. It's a bizarre thing. They thought Indian wheat is inferior. You know, it's a bizarre problem. But anyway, India had nothing to sell Iran. The only thing was pharmaceuticals. Indian pharmaceutical industry had a problem. They didn't want to sell entirely to Iran because they rely on the off-patent market in the United States to make their money. So all these contradictions aside, the removal of Iran from the SWIFT network was perhaps the biggest blow to Iran financially. It could not trade or deal with other countries. Now, why I raised the sanctions issue is that was the most potent or powerful Western weapon against Iran, in which the SWIFT was a very important, lever. Meanwhile, on the side, in the last finance ministerial meeting of the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, they've begun to discuss over the last 3-4 years a new financial architecture. You might follow this or may not, but over the Ukraine crisis, the West has threatened to remove Russia from the SWIFT network. And when this threat was made at this finance ministerial, the Russians floated the idea of not only having created a new development bank, the so-called BRICS bank, not only creating in the very short term BRICS ratings agencies to supplant Standard & Poor's and Moody's, but perhaps to create a BRICS-based financial transaction network to substitute from SWIFT. In other words, what this might mean is the most potent weapon that the West has of economic sanctions has an expiry date. That if the SWIFT network is supplanted by a BRICS kind of financial network in 5-10 years, then some of the toolkit of the West for economic sanctions will not be as powerful as they would be. For instance, the BRICS Bank already will provide short-term funding, what the IMF used to do. You know, if there is a liquidity problem for a country, the BRICS banks will have a window to provide liquidity to states which are running into trouble. And they would have no problem opening the window for Iran. So this economic sanctions, the most potent weapon, has an expiry date, which I think everybody knows. I mean, it's clear in Washington that there is awareness that this most potent weapon may not be powerful forever. Now, if I jump further and talk a little bit about the question of Iran gas, I don't know how many of you follow, I mean, I'm obsessed with trains, so I follow the Great Asian Train development, where this used to be a dream for people from the 1950s. The United Nations had a meeting about it, I think in Kyrgyzstan or somewhere in 1954, to design a train that was the southern route of the Grand Siberian Railroad that would go from the Chinese coastline out to perhaps Beirut. That was the idea. Now this train is being built. It's going from Lake Van over across northern Iran into Central Asia, and it will join and go all the way out to at least Beijing, if not to Shanghai. It's an incredible project. Alongside this huge project is a pipeline project. You know, when there was, again, these sanctions against Russia, the Russians and Chinese had a huge meeting late last year, and then again early this year, where they discussed a long-term energy strategy for the two countries. You know, to have Russian energy be delivered directly through pipelines into China. And there is, of course, has been a long-standing talk of Asian pipelines for Iranian gas. Remember when Condoleezza Rice came to Delhi in 2005, and she said, we're going to bring you out of the nuclear cold, but you have to vote for us in the IAEA. And you have to stop a process known as the peace pipeline. This was a project which goes back, you know, as long as I can remember, which was to run from the Fars gas field in Iran, a pipeline through Pakistan into India. And it was called the peace pipeline. This is kind of Thomas Friedman-esque. You know, Thomas Friedman had a theory about the Golden Arches theory of conflict resolution. I don't know if you've read his brilliant books, but the theory is if two countries have McDonald's, they won't go to war. That book came out, I think, in 1998, 99. And then within a month, India and Pakistan went to war in Kargil. And both have McDonald's. So much for the Golden Arches theory. But the theory with the pipeline was if there's a pipeline running through three countries, each of the countries will have less of, or maybe this would provide at least some stimulus or some incentive not to raise the temperature for war between the countries, because they have a lot at stake together. Now, I know this is also as silly as the Golden Arches theory, because after all, between Colombia and its neighbors, there have been pipelines running, and nonetheless, there have been border skirmishes and wars. So this is as silly of an argument. Nonetheless, this was the language from the 70s, 80s into the 90s, that if India and Pakistan could only have more commercial ties, then the politics will disappear. I don't agree with this way of thinking, but this was the way of thinking in the language. So Rice said openly in Delhi at a press conference, we submit that instead of this pipeline, which will be very unstable, you develop a civilian nuclear program. Standing next to her was the Indian foreign minister of the time, Mr. Natwar Singh, who embarrassed the Americans, and this became a backdoor problem, because he said India and Iran have historical ties. We are a people who are united by, the pabulum. We are united by centuries of connection, etc., which actually is true, but nonetheless, it was embarrassing. Okay. So this second problem for the economic weapon is the pipeline equation, which is a long-term equation, but nonetheless means that there is an expiry date in the medium to long term for this very powerful weapon, which is economic sanctions. One, because of the new financial architecture that will be created, and secondly, because perhaps these pipelines will come to fruition. By the way, the train line is almost working. You can go most of the way from Lake Van to China. It's an incredible project, and it's been happening largely out of the notice of the press. Okay. Now, there's an interesting development, 10, 15 minutes more. There's an interesting development, because the question I had said to you was until about 2003, the Iranian nuclear issue was not a crisis. It's true that in 1995, the United States government had a sanctions policy against Iran. Conoco had a $1 billion contract to develop some oil fields in Iran, and the US passed the Iran and Libya Sanctions Act. By the way, that's another very interesting parallel. The United States, Iran, and Libya Sanctions Act, and they have very divergent histories of where this Sanctions Act comes out. Because Libya, almost right after the US law began to open channels with the West, in April of 1999, the UN sanctions were suspended on Libya. Libya began to open the door to pay for the Lockerbie air disaster, the terrorist attack on the plane. They said we'll pay for it. They suspended their nuclear program, and by 2006, Libya got off the US list of state sponsors of terrorism. In 2008, Libya paid $1.5 billion. George W. Bush signed order number 13477, and that insulated Libya from lawsuits. That was in 2008. Of course, in 2011, none of those deals mattered, and Libya is now what it is. These things are in the minds of people in Tehran. When they see these parallels, they're not naive. When they understand the implications of how the Libya-Iran Sanctions Act played out for these two countries. They're two very different countries, one much larger, much more powerful in its integration. The other, Libya, it's a completely different story. Okay. In 2001 to 2003, the United States government did something very interesting, which we don't often talk about. The United States government went to war in two countries between 2001 and 2003 and knocked out Iran's two historical adversaries. First, it takes out the Taliban, which the Iranians hated, and basically opens the door from Tehran to Kabul, or at least to Herat. I mean, the entire western province of Afghanistan enters the sphere of influence of Iran. And it may surprise you to know that until a few years ago, when the last US government's report comes out on violations of sanctions on Iran, 50% of Afghan oil is bought directly from Iran. And about 20 to 25% of American troops' oil needs are bought from Iran. Because Afghanistan is a landlocked country, and the Americans would be crazy to fly in jumbo jets filled with oil, so they buy oil from the Iranians in the black market, which is coming right out of Herat, which essentially is another province of Iran. Meanwhile, in 2003, the United States government takes out Saddam Hussein. Now, some of you may know that from 1980 to 1988, Saddam Hussein, on behalf of the Gulf Arab states, prosecuted a long war against Iran, utilized chemical weapons, etc. It was a murderous, horrible war, the outcome of which was basically, the weakening of two countries. There was no victory for anybody, perhaps. Iran definitely deeply weakened by that war. It allowed the government in Tehran to deepen its hold in society. All adversaries inside were taken care of under the pretense of a war. I mean, it was Orwellian in its implications, that particular war. The Gulf Arabs promised $1 billion a month to the Iraqis. They reneged on the promise after 9 months. That war went on for 8 months. Saddam Hussein decided to invade Kuwait. It's not the first time the Iraqis have laid claim to Kuwait. That happened with Qasim in the 1950s as well. Okay, let me just say that suddenly the Americans come in and they knock out two of Iran's historical adversaries. Iran, in 1991, was in a position where they could have done something but didn't. And this is revealing of the caged-in nature of Iran till 2003. In 1991, when the Americans came in and removed the Iraqi armies from Kuwait, whether by CIA push or whoever, there was a call for an uprising in the southern provinces of Iraq, and largely Shia uprising takes place in the marshes, in the historical district of Sumeria, and there's nobody to help them. There's no air cover. This is not to say the Americans didn't have the capacity. You might remember as the Republican Guard retreated along the highway of death, they were bombed by American planes, and about 17,000 Iraqi troops were slaughtered as they returned north deeper into Iraq. So it's not that they didn't have the capacity. At the time, there was a call made for Iran to intervene, and I just want to read you this little quote, maybe lesser-known quote from Rafsanjani. And Rafsanjani publicly said, "We do not want to this is in 1991, we do not want to intervene in the internal affairs of Iraq. Our support only extends to the granting of refuge status to Iraqis fleeing their country. Our export of the revolution is not accomplished through war or the toppling of regimes. We export the revolution only by disseminating the thought of Imam Khomeini." Understand that in 1991, the country was in very bad shape. 2.5 years after the Iran-Iraq war had ended, it maybe didn't have the capacity to enter. And, you have to also remember that in 1991, there was a neoconservative faction in George H.W. Bush's circle who said, go all the way to Baghdad and then take a right turn to Tehran. And we just knock them all out in one go. And George H.W. Bush cautioned we don't want to do that. And in the breach, of course, the uprising in southern Iraq was crushed because nobody was going to come to their aid. Okay. Now, this changes, of course, in 2003. And not only does Iran get access now towards Herat and Afghanistan, but right up to the Mediterranean. And there's been several attempts, of course, to squelch Iranian influence in the region. Perhaps you might add to that the story of the 2006 war in Lebanon is part of that story. This is a political story. It is not a story about international, nuclear law. It's a political story which falls apart sometime this year. When the United States removes Saddam Hussein in 2003, they bring in an exiled group of people to take charge in Baghdad. People whose understanding of governance was framed in the exiles' world. It was a narrow dispensation. It narrowed the social fabric in a way, intensified contradictions, and the Americans, in a sense, contributed to the deepening sectarianization of Iraq, out of which provides a great opportunity for Iran. And hence, you get this situation. I'm going to end with just one or two observations about the nuclear deal and this context, this geopolitical context. There are times when you say things can be changed, and there are times when you say you have to take cognizance of reality and build a policy based on reality. One of the interesting features, I think, of the Obama administration with this Iran deal. If Obama didn't ever deserve the nuclear prize when he got it. I mean, he did nothing. If he didn't deserve it his entire career, this is something significant. There's nothing revolutionary in this deal. There's nothing, that's going to, improve the conditions of the whole of humanity. But it's going to lessen, I think, the obligation of a terrible escalation of conflict in the region. I think there is a modus vivendi coming into play. I fear that this is going to come on the backs of a lot of unfinished conflicts in the region, where there are just claims that people have which are going to get squelched, perhaps just claims in Syria, perhaps just claims in Bahrain, perhaps just claims in Yemen. But it seems that there is a new modus vivendi already in place, and I think that the second piece of evidence, one was the summoning of the Pakistani Prime Minister, and the second was the noises from Saudi Arabia that they want to cut a deal with the South Koreans for a nuclear program, which has within it the level of absurdity, because that would take about 30 or 40 years. These seem to be positionings or bargaining moves rather than an attempt to create a new modus operandi in the region. I think there's an understanding that a grand bargain of some kind might perhaps be in the works, and a grand bargain which is less grand and more a bargain, which is less about world-changing events and rather coming to terms with obvious realities that have been in place for over a decade. I think this deal is definitely going to go through, and I think one of the authors of that is Benjamin Netanyahu, who may win the election today or may not, but his arrival in Washington, D.C. has played a great role in getting this deal through. Because the one thing that the Republicans and some hawks in the Democratic Party could have done was to have joined together and written legislation that tightens the sanctions and overrides an Obama veto. But because Mr. Netanyahu came and because it became so deeply partisan and ugly, there will be not one Democratic senator who will vote with the Republicans on a new sanctions slate, which means Obama can easily veto any Republican bill which wants to increase sanctions. Secondly, I think the fact that 47 US Republicans, senators, wrote this letter to Iran has changed the tenor of the public understanding. And the hateful language that has come into this particular debate has emboldened the Obama administration. And I think it's in this context that you might see the statement made by John Kerry, where he said that the technical aspects of the negotiation are over. He said this on Sunday, and all that remains are the politics. What he means by the politics is interesting. He doesn't mean the geopolitics. I think he means tying up of loose ends. I think that's where they are. I fear that there will be not fear, I think there will be no problem to this deal going through. I would have very low expectations of what this means, but perhaps it will reduce the temperature on the antagonisms in the region that I think have created more problems than provided solutions for ordinary people. Thanks a lot.
Why is this double standard by the Security Council and the United States as a whole? Why they don't talk about Israel having a number of nuclear bombs and they are pursuing Iran alone? A lot of talk about the role of Saudi Arabia financing the nuclear bombs in Pakistan, and there are recent reports, I don't know, you know better than me, to what extent that Saudi Arabia is trying to get some nuclear bombs from Pakistan. To what extent the United States will provide a nuclear umbrella to the Gulf countries as a protection against Iran?
The United States already provides a nuclear umbrella to the Gulf countries, most recently through the Carter Doctrine, which basically says that the threat to the Gulf is a threat to the United States of America, and lucky for the Gulf countries, the great Emirate of Qatar, for instance, houses a huge American base north of Doha and west of Doha. It's often rumored that in the very great country of Bahrain, there is always on base tactical nuclear weapons. So if you put the Carter Doctrine side by side with at least these two bases, I think there's already a nuclear umbrella for the Gulf countries. That's a fait accompli. I think in the 1970s, there was a terrifically paranoid documentary, which everybody should watch, called The Islamic Bomb, which was about Pakistani scientists, Libyan chaps with suitcases of cash. I don't know if you remember this, but there were dark, video images, grainy, in hotel rooms of suitcases roughly pushed across tables, and Pakistanis, I don't know how good they are at cricket, trying to catch the suitcase and then walking out. I mean, there has been this fantasy, and it is probably the case. We don't know, because the network of, Mr. Khan from Pakistan was itself lucrative, because he ran the nuclear program and was using a sale of proliferated material to finance the program. So whether there was a need for Saudi money is not relevant. On the other hand, very many elements of the Pakistani state rely entirely on Saudi disbursements, including the election campaign of the current Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif is entirely financed by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And as I said, every once in a while when there's a problem, they second him and he flies right to Riyadh, he meets with them. And in Bahrain, for instance, when they need new police officers, they put ads in Pakistani newspapers saying, if you hate the Shia, come to Bahrain and you can earn good money. I mean, literally these are the ads. So, I think that the issue of the Islamic bomb is always on the table. I'm not sure that that's why they summoned Nawaz Sharif. I think he was summoned because there is this consolidation taking place, perhaps. The old consolidation from 1961 of the Organization of Islamic Countries. You remember that Morocco, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan were the founders of it, of the World Muslim League. This is that old consolidation, I think. These are the prime interlocutors, and they keep getting revived when there's any tension. The double standards, that's the world we live in. The reason I went on about India and Iran is because I think they're a cleaner example. Because everybody knows that the moral certificate for Israel is given annually multiple times by the United States. John Kerry, again, I think in a moment of weakness when he was being challenged by Netanyahu, said that, I can name 120 times in the UN where we helped you out. And most recently over the Goldstone report, not most recently, but dramatically, where again Condoleezza Rice was going to, Ban Ki-moon was going to the capital saying that you cannot allow the Goldstone report to move in any way out of the filing cabinet or the archive of the UN. So that moral certificate is inviolable, and I think that's just the way it's going to be for a while. So that's why I prefer the India and Iran example, because it leads to your second question, which is the question of drop objections to Iran. I don't think there is a political will in the West to drop objections to Iran, because the Iranian government continues to not be able to get a moral certificate from the West. However sophisticated their foreign minister, the West is not going to give them that moral certificate. All that will happen, I think, is if there's this 10-year caesura, 10-year, Hudna kind of situation, you're going to get, after that, very major changes in the world architecture, different financial systems, different kind of pipeline arrangements, where 10 years from now, it's going to be very hard to put economic pressure on Iran. So that's why if I was in the West, I would say, this is the time not to sign a 10-year deal. This is the time to sign a grand bargain. Because in 10 years, you're going to have no instruments. You won't be able to attack them militarily, and the economic sanctions will be meaningless. If you follow an international conference, I always like to go immediately to the ambassadors from the BRICS countries. I like to go and especially harass the Brazilians, who are perhaps the most sophisticated foreign service in the world. I mean, there are two countries who don't deserve the foreign service they have. One is Brazil, the other is Egypt. I mean, incredibly competent and smart, officers of the foreign service. I mean, I'm always bedazzled by the intelligence and curiosity and whatever. Until recently, the one foreign service that very rarely liked to tell you what they feel were the Chinese. And in the last 2 years, I have been struck, I mean, I think we've discussed this. I've been struck by the Chinese, for instance, saying, we are appalled by what's happening in Syria. The word appalled. I mean, I never thought I'd heard a diplomat from, the Chinese foreign ministry using words like appalled. I'm appalled by what's happening in Syria. I think what's happening with ISIS is unbelievable. It's outrageous. I mean, these are the words that I used. Immoral was the other thing. I think, the Chinese have for a long time had the view of, don't speak much, but don't carry a big stick either. Just try to influence things. And I have a very strong feeling that one of the miscalculations perhaps of the West over Ukraine, which, they may be legitimate, whatever's going on, I don't follow that at all. I mean, maybe a big Western plot, whatever's going on, I'm not aware of what's happening. But I do know that the miscalculation is that, I'll backtrack a little. In the Cancun meeting in 2003, which was over the Singapore issues of the Doha round of development, where they were discussing things like subsidies and boring things like that about trade, boring and inconsequential things like prices of food grains. Okay, India, Brazil, South Africa first created the IBSA group because they had a joint problem with how the negotiations were proceeding. For the history of Chinese diplomacy, they always were the plus C. So it was always the G77, the bloc of the South, plus C. It was always IBSA plus C. They didn't want to join any group. When in 2006 they joined the process that becomes BRICS, I was actually very surprised. The miscalculation is that the Chinese have felt for, I think, the Bush period, that they are considered, and the Americans say this openly, China is a threat, rising China, got to engage China, their military spending is too much. But they didn't react in any way except against Japan. Island skirmishes, etc. When Russia made the approach last year for tightening the security architecture and starting military exercises together, the Chinese agreed. So when I wrote my book on BRICS, I'd said one of the limitations of BRICS is they have no military ambitions, or no military capacity. This surprised me, that they are now going to start doing military exercises together in warm water areas of the world. That means not up in the Baltics, not in the North China Sea. They're going to go and do exercises elsewhere. I mean, this is a new world we've entered. They are more confident. I'm not necessarily confident that the vision they're going to provide is going to be a good one. All that I believe is that they are providing an alternative to unipolarity. It's merely an institutional, opportunity. Their own vision is not a progressive or interesting one to me. The issue is going to be what the rest of the world is capable of doing with the opening provided now from unipolarity to at least bipolarity. In the 1950s, the rest of the world created the non-aligned movement, seeing the opportunity of bipolarity. My interest is, will the rest of the world be up to it now? And this part of the region needs to be on that bandwagon. You can't leave everything to the South Americans.